A warm welcome to this lesson series on the Constitution of India. In today's lesson, we will first have a brief look at some of the historical developments that led to the enactment of the Constitution of India. And also, we will have a look at some of the sources from which the Constitution of India was framed. So, let us talk about how the Constitution of India was drafted. As you know, the Constitution of India is a legislation or it is an act, and therefore it had to be drafted. So let us have a look at how it was drafted. The body that has to be credited for drafting the Constitution of India is what is known as the Constituent Assembly, right? So the Constituent Assembly is the body that has drafted the Constitution of India. The Constituent Assembly came into being as a part of what is called the Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946. So the Cabinet Mission Plan basically came about so that the power could be transferred. From the British to India. Of course, the Cabinet Mission Plan wasn't truly a success, but this is to let you know that the Constituent Assembly came about because of the Cabinet Mission Plan. It spoke of the election of a Constituent Assembly, which means that there were to be members who were to be elected into the Constituent Assembly. The members of the Constituent Assembly, so you see this is 1946, India had not achieved independence as of then. But you should know that the persons who were members of the Constituent Assembly became members of Parliament once India achieved independence in 1947. So like I said, that there were members who were elected to the Constituent Assembly. Initially, there were 389 members in the Constituent Assembly who were elected, right? However, that later on fell to 299. The reason for that was that this number of 389 included some regions which are now in Pakistan. So as you know, the partition of India happened in 1947 and the Constituent Assembly, like we saw, was 1946, right? So as of 1946, there were 389 members. However, in 1947, after the formation of Pakistan, then the members that belonged to the regions that are presently in Pakistan had to leave this Constituent Assembly, and therefore the Constituent Assembly of India later on had only 299 members. So as you can see, this is 299 members, which is a lot of members, and they were divided into various committees. So remember that the Constituent Assembly was basically in charge of framing the constitution. So they had various committees, okay? There were totally 22 committees, out of which you can say 8 committees were the major committees and the remaining 14 were minor. So you can perhaps think of it like this: 8 were major committees, right? And the remaining 14 could be called as the minor committees, okay? So amongst all of them, the president of the Constituent Assembly was Dr. Rajendra Prasad. So he was the president of the entire Constituent Assembly. Now, amongst these 8 major committees, you can see that perhaps the most important committee was the drafting committee, okay, which is responsible for the drafting of the constitution. And the chairman of the drafting committee was Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. So remember one thing, do not call him the chairman of the Constituent Assembly. He is the chairman of the drafting committee of the Constituent Assembly, which was a very important committee, and therefore sometimes Dr. Ambedkar is also referred to as the father of the Indian Constitution. Framing the Constitution of India was no easy task. Therefore, the Constituent Assembly took a really long time for it to come up with the Constitution. To be precise, it took 2 years, 11 months and 18 days for the Constitution to be framed. As you can see, this is just 12 days short of 3 years. Therefore, you can remember it like this, that it took almost 3 years for the Constitution of India to be framed by the Constituent Assembly. It took all of 114 meetings, so these 299 people, and before the independence it was 389, they had 114 meetings starting with the December of 1946 and it went on until the Constitution was framed. So they had 114 meetings over the course of these 3 years. Now, This is a very important point. You see, India is a land of diversity. So there are people who represent very diverse ideas, cultures, thoughts, and emotions in India, very diverse sentiments. So the Constituent Assembly consisted of people from all walks and spheres of life. And therefore, there used to be a lot of healthy debating that took place while the Constitution was being framed. These form what are known as the Constituent Assembly debates, right? This is also a very interesting source of knowledge for a person who wants to learn about the Constitution of India. So these are all written down day wise, so you know as to which person, which member offered an argument, and all of this forms a part of the Constituent Assembly debates. And then, as a result of all of this, we had the Constitution of India, which is one of the largest and the longest written constitutions of the world. So, after all this effort, the Constituent Assembly adopted the Constitution on the 26th of November 1949. Remember that it was adopted on 26th of November 1949. However, it came into effect on the 26th of January 1950. 26th of January, of course, as you know, is the Republic Day. You might also be aware that recently we have been seeing what is called the Constitution Day. It has been proclaimed since 2015, and the Constitution Day is basically the 26th of November. So now you know as to why the Constitution Day is celebrated on the 26th of November. Now, as you can see, India became independent in 1947, which, if you see in terms of world history, is quite late, right? So there were many nations that had become independent and that had their constitutions much before 1947. Therefore, it was only logical that those who were framing the Constitution of India took some inspiration or borrowed some ideas from other countries. And therefore, it's important for us to now see some of the sources from which the Constitution of India was framed. So let us look at some of the sources of the Constitution of India one by one. We start with what is known as the Government of India Act of 1935, right? So as you know, right through the history of the British rule in India, there were many laws that were enacted. In fact, if you notice, even the Indian Penal Code, for example, was enacted in the year 1860, which was during the British rule. Okay, so there were many laws that were enacted while the British were in India. The Government of India Act of 1935 is a very important act. It is perhaps one of the largest sources of the Constitution of India. Right. So there are many provisions of the Government of India Act that find themselves in the Constitution of India. The Constitution of India has received several important provisions, such as the existence of a federal legislature, which means that there is a legislature at the center as well as at the state. This is what is called a federal system, right? When there's a central government as well as a state government. So this is a federal legislature, a feature that is got from the Government of India Act of 1935. The Government of India Act of 1935 has also given the provisions relating to the office of the governor and also several provisions relating to administrative details. These are very intricate provisions which find themselves in the Constitution based on what you have in the Government of India Act of 1935. It's important for you to know that the Government of India Act was the longest act passed by the British Parliament until then, right? And this is not just for India. The British Parliament, even in its own country, had not passed an act as long as the Government of India Act of 1935, right? So the purpose of the Government of India Act of 1935 was that it was required to meet some of the demands that were made by the Indian politicians, right? However, the act didn't really meet many of those demands, but still it continues to remain one of the most important sources of the Constitution of India. Now, going ahead, we look at some of the countries from which these ideas or principles have been inspired or borrowed. The most important nation, of course, is the United Kingdom itself. we were ruled by the British, and therefore we are very deeply influenced by the United Kingdom. So there are some important provisions such as the parliamentary form of government, right? So the form of government that we have here itself is taken from the United Kingdom. We also have got the principle of the rule of law. Now, what is rule of law? Rule of law means that there is no person above the law. The law applies equally to every person. So no person, no man is above the law, and that there is equality before the law. So the law is supreme. So the supremacy of the law is basically rule of law, and this is something that we get from the United Kingdom, and we also find this in the Constitution of India in Article 14. Likewise, the provision of single citizenship, which means that you can only keep the citizenship of India, which means let us say you're a resident of maybe Delhi and you're a resident of India, of course. That doesn't mean that you get citizenship of Delhi as well as of India. You get only one single citizenship, the citizenship of India. So this again is a principle that is taken from the United Kingdom. Moving ahead, we look at the United States of America. So the United States of America had also received its independence from British colonial rule, right? So the USA was also a British colony at one point. However, it received its independence sooner than India did. And United States of America enacted what is known as the Bill of Rights, right? So this Bill of Rights is what gave its citizens the fundamental rights. And therefore, fundamental rights is something that we can say has been received as a legacy of the United States of America. Okay. Then there is this thing that is called judicial review. What is judicial review? Judicial review basically means that the judiciary can review. What can it review? It can review a legislation. It can basically review an act that is done by the parliament, okay? Which means that, let us say there's a legislation and it is felt that the legislation is not right. Maybe it infringes somebody's fundamental right, or it contains some other defect. Then the fact that the judiciary can review this is a power of judicial review which is given to the courts, right? So we understand that the courts are the guardians of our right. So for example, we say that the Supreme Court of India is the supreme guardian of our rights, right? Or you can say it is the custodian of our rights. Custodian basically means that our rights are in the custody of the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court has to guard our rights, and it does that through the power often of judicial review. So suppose there is a law that takes away our fundamental rights, that abridges our fundamental rights, then the Supreme Court or the courts can intervene by exercise of their power of judicial review. Next, we look at the Irish Constitution or the Constitution of Ireland. So one of the most important features received from Ireland is what is known as the DPSP, which expands as the Directive Principles of State Policy. Directive Principles of State Policy. This you find in part 4 of the Constitution of India. Okay. So basically, Directive Principles of State Policy means that there are some principles that the state, which basically means that the Indian government, that India, has to follow as a part of its policy. So the principles that the state must follow as a part of its policy is what you find in the directive principles. Okay. So these direct as to how India frames its policy, and this is something that we receive from the Irish Constitution. Also, the election of the president. As you know, India is a republic, right? So we call India the Republic of India, right? So India is a republic, which means that we have an elected head of state, elected head of state. And the head of state is the president. So the manner in which he is elected is adopted from the Irish method of the election of the president. Our next source is USSR, the Soviet Union. So USSR is the erstwhile name for present day Russia. So what we got from USSR was the concept of fundamental duties. Now, I want to give you a little task here. You find fundamental duties mentioned in Article 51A, Article 51A of the Constitution. Now, Article 51A was not a part of the original Constitution, right? So it has been introduced later on. So I want you to tell me as to which year it was introduced in. So my question basically is, in which year was fundamental duties inserted into the Constitution of India? Likewise, we look at some more sources. For example, Germany. Now, the German constitution is also called the Weimar Constitution. So from Germany, we received the emergency provisions. Now, what is an emergency? An emergency is basically a situation, a pressing situation, because of which the constitution starts to behave differently, which means the governance of the country changes because of the situations that are prevailing. You must be aware of the emergency that was declared in India during the 70s, during the prime ministership of Indira Gandhi. So at that point, the emergency provisions were pressed into operation, and that results in a different behavior. So those provisions were inspired by the German constitution. Then we look at the constitution of France. So you see, the French constitution was influenced by the French Revolution. And some of the words that were very important and critical to the French Revolution were liberty, equality, and fraternity, right? So we all understand what these mean. Liberty is basically that you allow people the freedom to do what they want to. Equality, and then fraternity. Fraternity is basically the spirit of brotherhood. So these, as you can see, are also incorporated into the preamble of India. So you find these words mentioned in the preamble of the Constitution of India. Likewise, we also have borrowed from the Australian Constitution. If you look at Article 19 of the Constitution, it gives you the right to freedom. And in there, you will find that there is a freedom of trade. And therefore, that's a feature that has been borrowed from the Australian Constitution. So we just learnt in this lesson that the Constitution of India was drafted by some of the brightest legal scholars over a period of almost 3 years, borrowing from the best parts of several constitutions across the world. Therefore, the Constitution of India is sometimes referred to as a beautiful patchwork. I hope this lesson was of use to you. Thank you so much for your patience. Good day.